Ever think history is just a collection of facts set in stone, unchanging and certain? Well, prepare for a surprise. What we think we know about the past is constantly being challenged and rewritten as new evidence emerges, like pieces of a puzzle that suddenly show a completely different picture. Sometimes those long-held beliefs, the ones you learned in school, turn out to be, well, just plain wrong. That's the thrilling, dynamic nature of historical research, the constant possibility of discovery that upends everything. We're diving into 30 fascinating instances where the experts, the historians themselves, had their initial conclusions proven wrong. From ancient civilizations to more recent events across continents and cultures, we'll explore how new findings have forced a fundamental shift in our understanding. Get ready to see history not as a finished book, but as a living, breathing mystery, always unfolding, always revealing more layers, and always reminding us that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing adventure. These 30 cases aren't just about mistakes. They're about the exciting process of learning, of challenging assumptions, and of uncovering the past with fresh eyes. Let's start with perhaps one of the most infamous historical deceptions, the Piltdown Man. Back in 1912, a discovery in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England, sent ripples of excitement through the scientific community. Here, amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson, along with others, unearthed what they claimed were fragments of an early human skull and jawbone. The pieces, when assembled, suggested a creature with a large brain like a modern human but with ape-like jaws. This Piltdown Man, or Eanthropus dawsoni as it was formerly named, seemed to be the perfect missing link, a crucial piece of the puzzle in human evolution, conveniently found in England, supporting certain theories popular at the time about the origins of humanity. For decades, this find was widely accepted and studied, becoming a cornerstone of paleoanthropology textbooks. Leading scientists examined the bones, wrote papers on the implications, and built entire evolutionary timelines around this supposed ancestor. It became deeply ingrained in the understanding of how humans evolved, fitting neatly into existing ideas about brain size developing early in our lineage. But there was a nagging feeling among some. The jaw and skull seemed almost too perfect a match for what was expected, and the differences were stark. Slowly, over decades, the evidence began to mount against Piltdown Man, fueled by new discoveries elsewhere that didn't align. It wasn't until 1953, 40 years after the initial find, that advanced scientific techniques like fluorine absorption tests and meticulous examination definitively exposed the truth. The Piltdown Man was a carefully constructed forgery, a clever combination of a modern human skull and the jawbone of an orangutan, with filed-down teeth to make them appear more human-like. This wasn't just a simple error. It was a deliberate hoax that fooled many of the brightest minds in the field for a remarkably long time. The fallout was significant, casting a shadow over the individuals involved and highlighting the critical need for relentless skepticism and rigorous, verifiable scientific methods in historical and anthropological research. It underscored the importance of questioning assumptions, no matter how appealing they might seem, and served as a powerful, albeit embarrassing, lesson for the scientific community. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. For years, the dominant story of how people first arrived in the Americas centered on a relatively narrow window of time. The established theory pointed to a migration across the Bering Land Bridge, a strip of land connecting Siberia and Alaska that emerged during the last ice age when sea levels dropped. The thinking went that hunter-gatherers followed migrating animals across this bridge, and then through an ice-free corridor that opened up in the North American ice sheets, arriving in the Americas around 13,000 years ago. This timeline closely aligned with the widely recognized Clovis culture, known for their distinctive fluted projectile points found across North America, which were believed to represent the earliest widespread human presence. For a long time, finding any evidence of humans before Clovis was met with intense skepticism, often dismissed as unreliable or misinterpreted. It was a neat, tidy narrative that held sway for decades in archaeological circles and textbooks. However, like many firmly held beliefs, this one faced increasing pressure from challenging evidence unearthed at various sites. Think about a place like Monte Verde in southern Chile. Far, far south of where that ice-free corridor would have been, archaeologists uncovered artifacts and evidence of human habitation dating back 14,500 years and potentially even earlier. This was a bombshell. If people were living that far south at that time, they must have entered the Americas centuries, perhaps even millennia, before the traditional Clovis first timeline. Monte Verde wasn't an isolated case. Sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania also presented evidence of human activity older than 13,000 years. These finds were initially controversial, sparking heated debates within the archaeological community. Critics questioned the dating methods, the interpretation of the artifacts, and even the possibility of such early migration given the supposed ice barriers. But as more sites yielded pre-Clovis dates, supported by increasingly rigorous dating techniques and interdisciplinary research, the weight of the evidence became undeniable. The story of the peopling of the Americas began to open up, moving beyond a single migration event and a single entry point. It suggested perhaps multiple waves of migration, possibly along coastal routes, and certainly much earlier than previously thought. This shift hasn't just added a few centuries to the timeline. It has fundamentally changed our understanding of early human movements and adaptability, revealing a more complex and ancient history of the Americas. It shows how persistent investigation and the courage to question established paradigms are essential for uncovering the full story of the past. Many people picture Cleopatra as purely Egyptian, a queen embodying the ancient traditions of the pharaohs. It's a common image often reinforced in popular culture, yet the historical truth is a bit more nuanced, and understanding it changes how we view her life and her powerful connections to Rome. Cleopatra VII, the famous last pharaoh of Egypt, was not, in fact, ethnically Egyptian. Her lineage traces back to Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. When Alexander died and his vast empire was divided, Ptolemy took control of Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty. For nearly 3 centuries, this line of Greek Macedonian rulers governed Egypt, maintaining their Hellenistic culture. Language Koine Greek was the language of the court, and traditions, often remaining somewhat separate from the native Egyptian population. Cleopatra was a direct descendant of this Greek line. While she did, famously, learn the Egyptian language, a rare feat among the Ptolemies, her family and court were fundamentally Greek. Recognizing Cleopatra's Hellenistic background isn't just a minor historical detail. It significantly impacts our understanding of her political maneuvering and Egypt's place in the ancient world. During her reign, Egypt was a Hellenistic kingdom, albeit one with deep historical roots in ancient Egypt, interacting with a rapidly expanding Roman Republic. Cleopatra's relationships with Roman leaders like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just personal. They were strategic alliances between the last major Hellenistic power and the rising Roman superpower. Her Greek identity and education shaped her perspective, influencing her diplomatic skills and her understanding of the broader Mediterranean political scene. Historical sources, particularly those written by Greek and Roman authors like Plutarch and Cassius Dio, make her Ptolemaic lineage clear, describing the dynasty's origins and its Greek customs. Understanding this helps us see Cleopatra not just as an exotic Eastern queen, but as a sophisticated Hellenistic ruler navigating a complex world shaped by both Greek tradition and Roman ambition. This revised view offers a richer, more accurate picture of the dynamic cultural and political forces at play in ancient Egypt during a pivotal time of transition. Before the determined digging began, ancient Troy, the setting of Homer's epic Iliad, was considered by many to be little more than a legendary city, a product of poetic imagination. For centuries, scholars and historians viewed the Iliad as a magnificent work of literature, but questioned whether the grand tale of the Trojan War, with its formidable walls and heroic battles, was based on a historical reality. Was there ever a place called Troy? Did a war like the one described by Homer truly happen? The prevailing view leaned toward skepticism, seeing the story as rich mythology rather than historical fact. Enter Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy German businessman with an almost obsessive passion for Homer. Unlike the academic establishment, Schliemann firmly believed that the Iliad contained not just great stories but genuine geographical clues. He took Homer's descriptions of the landscape surrounding Troy, the distance from the sea, and the local topography as if they were ancient maps. His conviction was so strong that he funded his own archaeological expeditions, determined to find physical evidence of this fabled city. Following Homer's text with remarkable faith, Schliemann focused his search on a mound known as Hisarlik in northwestern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. In the 1870s, he began excavating this site, a place previous scholars had largely overlooked or dismissed. What Schliemann unearthed was astonishing. As he dug down through layers of earth, he began to find the remains of multiple cities built one on top of another, spanning thousands of years. Among these layers were fortifications, pottery, and evidence of destruction by fire findings that seemed to resonate with the descriptions in the Iliad. Schliemann was convinced he had found Troy, specifically identifying one heavily fortified layer, which he labeled Troy II, as Homer's city, even finding what he believed was Priam's treasure, though this particular identification was later questioned and found to be from an earlier period. His dramatic finds and bold claims initially met with considerable resistance from established archaeologists, who were often critical of his methods, which were quite destructive by modern standards. However, the sheer fact that a large, ancient city existed at Hisarlik, in precisely the location Homer seemed to indicate, provided undeniable proof that the legend of Troy had a historical basis. Subsequent, more systematic excavations by other archaeologists confirmed that Hisarlik was indeed the site of Troy, identifying several different layers as potential candidates for the Troy of the Trojan War, most notably Layer 7A. Schliemann, despite his sometimes flawed techniques and sensationalist interpretations, had indisputably proven that Troy was not just a myth but a real place, a crucial finding that forever changed the relationship between epic poetry and historical archaeology. Standing on Salisbury Plain in England, the massive stone circles of Stonehenge have puzzled observers for centuries. What was this monumental structure for? Early ideas about its purpose were incredibly varied and often reflected the knowledge and beliefs of the time. For a long period, one popular theory linked Stonehenge to the Druids, the priests of the ancient Celtic religion. Influential antiquarians like William Stukeley in the 18th century passionately argued that it was a great temple built by the Druids for their rituals, a place of worship and sacrifice. This idea captured the public imagination and became widely accepted, even though the construction of Stonehenge predates the peak of Druidic influence by many centuries. Other early speculations were even wilder. Some thought it was built by the Romans, perhaps as a temple to their gods, due to a general tendency to attribute impressive ancient ruins in Britain to the known historical power of Rome. These early theories, while interesting, were largely based on assumption, folklore, and limited archaeological understanding. They were educated guesses, but without the tools and techniques available today, they couldn't uncover the deeper, more complex truth. Fast forward to the age of modern archaeology, astronomy, and computational analysis, and a far more sophisticated picture of Stonehenge emerges. Instead of a simple temple or a Roman ruin, research now strongly indicates that Stonehenge served a complex purpose, intricately connected to the movements of the sun and moon. It appears to have functioned as a sophisticated astronomical calendar or observatory. The key lies in the precise alignments of the stones. One of the most famous alignments is with the sunrise on the summer solstice. If you stand at the center of the monument on the longest day of the year, the sun rises directly over the heel stone located outside the main circle. Similarly, the monument aligns with the sunset on the winter solstice. These aren't coincidences, they point to careful planning and a deep understanding of celestial cycles by the ancient builders. Further analysis has revealed potential alignments marking the equinoxes and even more complex lunar cycles, suggesting a knowledge of astronomy far beyond what those early historians imagined. This revised understanding, supported by detailed surveys, radiocarbon dating of materials found at the site, and archaeoastronomical studies, shows Stonehenge wasn't just a place of worship, though it likely had religious significance, but a sophisticated tool for tracking time, seasons, and possibly even predicting celestial events. It reveals a level of scientific understanding among prehistoric peoples that earlier theories simply couldn't grasp, transforming our view of the capabilities of these ancient builders. For centuries, the common narrative about the Vikings painted a picture of skilled seafarers and fearsome raiders, but their reach was often thought to be largely confined to northern Europe, places like the British Isles, Ireland, France, and Russia. While their impact in these regions was undeniable and well documented, the idea of their voyages extending much further west across the vast Atlantic to North America was largely considered the stuff of Norse sagas and legends, not solid historical fact. Most historians placed the earliest documented European arrival in the Americas centuries later, with Christopher Columbus in 1492. The sagas, like the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, spoke of lands across the Western Ocean called Vinland, Markland, and Helluland, but these were generally dismissed as folklore, too fantastic to be true. The evidence just wasn't there in the archaeological record. Then came a series of remarkable discoveries that completely upended this limited view. Starting in the 1960s, a Norwegian explorer and writer named Helge Ingstad, and later his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, began investigating potential Viking sites in North America, guided by the descriptions in the sagas. Their search led them to a remote cove on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, called Elance Ox Meadows. What they unearthed there was nothing short of revolutionary. Through meticulous excavation of grassy mounds, they uncovered the clear outlines of structures unlike anything built by the indigenous peoples of the region. These were the remains of buildings constructed in a distinctly Norse style, including longhouses, workshops, and a smithy. The evidence found at Elance Ox Meadows wasn't just architectural. Archaeologists also found a range of artifacts that definitively linked the site to the Vikings. There were iron rivets used in shipbuilding, which would have been essential for repairing the longships that made such a journey possible. They found a soapstone spindle whorl, an object used for spinning wool, indicating the presence of women and suggesting a settlement rather than just a temporary camp. There were also bronze and bone pins, a stone lamp, and evidence of ironworking, activities consistent with Viking settlements in Greenland and Iceland, but completely alien to the known material culture of the Native American groups in Newfoundland at that time. Crucially, radiocarbon dating of materials from the site placed its occupation firmly around 1,000 years ago, precisely within the time frame when the Norse sagas describe voyages to lands west of Greenland. This was concrete, tangible proof that Vikings had indeed sailed to North America, built settlements, and lived there, albeit likely for a relatively short period, some 500 years before Columbus's arrival. Elance Ox Meadows, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, stands as a powerful testament to the broader extent of Viking exploration and forces us to acknowledge a much earlier chapter in the history of European contact with the Americas, moving the narrative from legend to verified fact. Think about ancient architecture. When we picture Roman structures, we often imagine massive stone blocks like the Colosseum, right? For a long time, even historians tended to view Roman construction techniques as relatively straightforward, impressive for their scale, sure, but maybe lacking the complexity of later engineering. The assumption was that their concrete was simply a basic mix of lime, water, and aggregate, a common building material but perhaps not particularly sophisticated. This view underestimated one of the Romans' most significant and enduring technological achievements, their concrete. Modern analyses, taking a much closer look at surviving Roman structures, have completely overturned this earlier, simpler idea. Structures like the Pantheon in Rome, with its massive unreinforced concrete dome that has stood for nearly 2,000 years, are powerful testaments to the material's incredible durability. Scientists and engineers studying Roman concrete have discovered it was far more advanced than previously thought. It wasn't just a simple mix. The Romans incorporated specific ingredients and methods that gave their concrete remarkable properties that in some ways even surpass modern concrete's resistance to decay, especially in harsh environments like saltwater. The Romans used what's known as pozzolanic ash, a volcanic ash readily available in regions around Italy, particularly from areas near modern-day Naples. When mixed with lime and water, this volcanic ash reacted chemically in a way that made the concrete incredibly strong and durable. This reaction, known as a pozzolanic reaction, continues over time, actually increasing the concrete's strength and making it resistant to cracking caused by things like freeze-thaw cycles or exposure to seawater, which is notorious for degrading modern concrete. Furthermore, recent research suggests they might have even used hot mixing techniques, incorporating quicklime that reacted exothermically, potentially creating self-healing properties within the concrete. This sophisticated understanding of material science, utilizing natural resources like volcanic ash and precise mixing techniques, allowed the Romans to build structures of unprecedented scale and longevity, challenging our initial assumptions about the limits of ancient engineering and highlighting their ingenious mastery of materials. Walk through any major museum with a collection of classical art, and you'll likely encounter rows of stunning statues gleaming with the smooth, white beauty of marble. This image of pristine, unpainted stone has been the popular perception of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture for centuries, shaping our idea of their aesthetic ideals. We've come to associate the classical world with a minimalist, monochromatic elegance, based on the appearance of these surviving artworks after millennia of exposure and burial stripped away their original finishes. This long-held assumption that these statues were always intended to be white was the prevailing view for a very, very long time. It seemed obvious they were made of white marble after all. But here's where modern science steps in and reveals a much more colorful truth. Using techniques that look beyond what's visible to the naked eye, such as ultraviolet UV light analysis, which can pick up traces of pigments invisible in normal light, and chemical analysis of surface residues, researchers have found compelling evidence that many, if not most, ancient Greek and Roman statues were originally painted in vibrant and sometimes surprisingly bold colors. Imagine seeing the Parthenon friezes not in stark white marble, but with figures' robes in rich reds and blues, skin tones depicted with realism, and even intricate patterns decorating armor and architectural elements. These weren't just subtle washes. The evidence points to significant use of yellows, greens, blacks, and other pigments, creating a polychromatic world that is hard for us to fully envision today. This discovery is far more than just an interesting detail about ancient art. It fundamentally reshapes our understanding of the classical world's visual culture and aesthetic sensibilities. It tells us that the ancient Greeks and Romans appreciated and utilized color in ways we hadn't fully appreciated. Their public spaces, their temples, and their sculptures were likely far more lively and visually stimulating than the stark white images we hold. It challenges our modern, often neoclassical, idealization of antiquity as purely white and minimalist, revealing a more complex and perhaps more human artistic taste. It forces us to reconsider what beauty meant to them and how different their world would have looked to someone living at the time, experiencing these sculptures not as weathered white relics, but as brightly painted, almost lifelike figures populating their cities. For a long time, if you asked a historian the exact year the ancient Olympic Games began, they'd give you one specific answer: 776 BC. This date isn't arbitrary. It comes from later Greek chronographers like Hippias of Elis, who compiled lists of Olympic victors, effectively creating a historical timeline rooted in these athletic contests held every 4 years at the sanctuary of Zeus in Olympia. These records provided a seemingly firm foundation, establishing the Olympic Games as a crucial marker in ancient Greek history, a way to count years and structure their understanding of the past. So, 776 BC became the standard starting point for the Games, a widely accepted fact taught in classrooms and cited in historical texts for generations. But history, as we've seen, loves a good surprise. While the literary sources point to that specific year, archaeological work at the site of Olympia itself tells a slightly different story, suggesting that the area was active and likely hosted some form of athletic or religious activity well before 776 BC. Excavations have revealed layers dating back earlier, with findings that indicate the sanctuary was in use and possibly hosting events that were precursors to the formalized games. This doesn't necessarily mean the written records from later Greeks were fabricating the date entirely, but it does open up questions about what the first Olympic Games truly means. Was 776 BC the moment the Games became formalized, perhaps recorded more systematically, rather than the absolute beginning of all activity? Today, the discussion among historians and archaeologists is more nuanced. While 776 BC remains the traditionally accepted date for the official start, marked by the first recorded victor, the ongoing research highlights that the sanctuary of Olympia had a longer, more complex history of religious and potentially athletic gatherings. It prompts us to consider the evolution of the Games. Did they spring fully formed in one specific year? Or were they a gradual development, evolving from local religious festivals and athletic contests over a more extended period? This ongoing debate isn't about disproving the existence of the Games or the value of the ancient lists. It's about refining our understanding of their origins, acknowledging that the beginning might be more of a process than a single, precise moment frozen in time. It's a reminder that even seemingly exact historical dates can be points of scholarly discussion, revealing the dynamic nature of historical inquiry. When we talk about Alexander the Great, the sheer speed and scale of his conquests are often highlighted. Right, he swept across vast territories in a remarkably short amount of time. Early historical interpretations, while acknowledging this rapid pace, might not have fully appreciated how he achieved it. It's easy to just say he was a military genius and had a great army, but that doesn't explain the mechanics behind moving tens of thousands of soldiers, many on foot, across diverse and often hostile landscapes, fighting battles, besieging cities, and maintaining control over newly conquered regions, all at a blistering pace. The initial focus was often on his tactical brilliance and the valor of his troops, without a deep dive into the nuts and bolts of his operations. Delving deeper into historical sources and applying modern logistical understanding paints a picture of something far more complex than just brilliant battlefield leadership. Alexander's military machine was incredibly sophisticated for its time, a finely tuned system of organization and support that made his rapid expansion possible. His administration understood the absolute necessity of efficient supply lines. This wasn't just about food and water. It included weapons, armor, medical supplies, and even engineers and skilled laborers for building bridges and siege equipment. He wasn't just conquering territory, he was building or utilizing infrastructure as he went, establishing a network of fortresses, supply depots, and communication routes that allowed his army to remain mobile and effective far from its starting point. He recognized the importance of local resources, often requiring conquered cities or regions to provide supplies and manpower, reducing the burden on his own logistics train. Furthermore, the structure of his army itself was a marvel of organization. It wasn't a single, unwieldy mass. Alexander commanded a combined force of infantry, the famous Macedonian phalanx, formidable cavalry units like the companion cavalry, and specialized troops like engineers, archers, and siege experts. This diverse composition allowed him to adapt to different terrains and different types of enemies. Crucially, his army had a highly developed staff system. His generals and officers were capable and well-trained, able to manage their divisions and execute complex maneuvers. Communication, though challenging across vast distances, was relatively effective for the era, allowing him to coordinate movements and react quickly to changing circumstances. Modern analysis, looking at things like march rates, supply consumption, and environmental factors, helps us appreciate the immense logistical challenges Alexander overcame. It shows that his rapid conquests weren't just due to audacious charges and battlefield victories. They were underpinned by an extraordinary level of planning, organization, and logistical acumen that allowed his army to sustain itself and move with unprecedented speed and efficiency across a vast empire. It's a testament to the administrative and engineering brilliance that went hand in hand with his military prowess. Stretching across the arid plains of southern Peru are the enigmatic Nazca lines, colossal geoglyphs etched into the desert floor. For a long time, without the benefit of seeing them from above, early visitors and researchers could really only guess at their purpose. Imagine walking across this vast, flat landscape, seeing only fragments of lines and shapes beneath your feet. It was easy to assume these were just practical features, maybe ancient pathways connecting settlements, guiding travelers across the featureless terrain, or perhaps even channels for water management, though the climate made extensive irrigation seem unlikely. These initial assumptions were understandable given the limited perspective. If you can't see the whole picture, you fill in the blanks with what seems most logical for human activity in such an environment. The scale and complexity of many of the designs remained hidden, leading to these rather simplistic interpretations of what the Nazca people were up to. But everything changed with the advent of aerial photography. Suddenly, these seemingly random lines and simple shapes transformed into something breathtakingly complex and detailed. Seeing the Nazca lines from an airplane or helicopter revealed stunning depictions of animals, hummingbirds, monkeys, spiders, fish, along with geometric shapes like trapezoids, triangles, and spirals, and even depictions of human-like figures spanning hundreds of feet. These weren't just simple paths, they were deliberate, monumental works of art or design visible only from a significant height. This shift in perspective completely shattered the earlier theories. How could pathways suddenly resolve into the image of a condor or a killer whale? It became clear that the purpose of the lines was far more profound and mysterious than previously imagined. With the true nature of the lines revealed, the hunt for their real meaning intensified, leading to a variety of theories that move far beyond simple practicality. One prominent idea suggests a connection to astronomy and calendrical functions. Scholars like Maria Reich, who dedicated decades to studying and preserving the lines, proposed that some of the lines and figures pointed to celestial events like solstices or the rising and setting of certain stars, serving as a giant astronomical calendar to track agricultural cycles or important dates. Another compelling theory posits a religious or ritualistic purpose. Perhaps the lines were sacred paths used in processions, with the figures representing deities or spiritual concepts meant to be seen by the gods from the sky, or linked to rituals involving water and fertility, crucial concerns in the arid Nazca region. Some trapezoids, for instance, show signs of foot traffic within their boundaries, suggesting they were areas for gathering or movement. Still, other interpretations suggest the lines were related to water sources, pointing to underground springs or crucial resources in the desert landscape, though not as simple irrigation channels. The sheer scale and effort required to create them, meticulously removing the reddish-brown surface rock to expose the lighter earth underneath, strongly indicate a purpose of great significance to the Nazca culture, whether for communicating with the divine, aligning with the cosmos, or binding their community through monumental labor and shared belief. While no single theory has been definitively proven, the shift from viewing them as mere pathways to recognizing them as complex, possibly astronomically or religiously significant geoglyphs, represents a dramatic evolution in our understanding of this ancient civilization. When you first hear about the Silk Road, what typically comes to mind? Probably images of caravans loaded with exotic goods, shimmering silk from China, aromatic spices from the east, precious gems, and rare metals making their way westward, while gold, silver, and woolen goods traveled the other way. For a long time, this focus on the things being traded was the primary way historians understood this vast network of routes connecting east and west across Eurasia. The conventional view saw it mainly as a channel for economic exchange, a conduit for luxury goods to move between distant markets. This perspective, while not wrong, was undeniably incomplete, painting only a partial picture of the vibrant interactions happening along these paths. However, deeper dives into historical records and more extensive archaeological work along the various branches of the Silk Road have revealed a far richer, more dynamic reality. It wasn't just goods that traversed these routes. The Silk Road was a superhighway for ideas, beliefs, technologies, and artistic styles. Imagine monks carrying sacred texts and spreading religions like Buddhism from India to Central Asia and eventually China, or Christianity making its way eastward and later Islam following suit. These weren't just isolated exchanges, they profoundly shaped the spiritual landscapes of entire regions, leading to the construction of monasteries and mosques and influencing local practices and beliefs. Beyond religion, practical knowledge and innovations also traveled the Silk Road. Paper-making technology, originating in China, moved westward, eventually transforming record-keeping and literacy in the Middle East and Europe. Advances in irrigation techniques, metallurgy, and even musical instruments were shared and adapted by peoples along the route. Artistic influences flowed back and forth. You can see it in the blending of styles in frescoes found in Central Asian caves, incorporating elements from Indian, Persian, and Chinese art. This constant, vibrant exchange of culture and technology fundamentally changed the societies the Silk Road connected, fostering a level of interconnectedness that went far beyond mere commerce. It highlights how these ancient arteries facilitated a complex web of human interaction, demonstrating that trade routes are often pathways for much more than just tangible goods. When we picture the Ice Age, one of the most iconic images is undoubtedly the woolly mammoth, these massive, shaggy creatures roaming the frozen plains. For a long time, based on the fossil evidence available, which was often fragmented and scattered, historians and paleontologists tended to estimate that mammoth populations, while significant, were perhaps not as vast as we might imagine across the entire northern hemisphere. Initial estimates were often conservative, piecing together a picture from the limited clues unearthed in various locations. It was easy to think of them as impressive, but maybe not overwhelmingly numerous across the entirety of their range. That picture began to change dramatically with new discoveries and the application of modern scientific techniques. Think about the sheer scale of some of the more recent findings: vast bone beds containing the remains of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of mammoths discovered in places like Siberia and North America. These aren't just a few scattered bones. They are enormous concentrations of remains that speak to a much larger presence on the landscape than had been previously calculated. Additionally, genetic studies analyzing DNA extracted from mammoth remains have provided powerful new insights into their population structure, diversity, and overall numbers across their vast range from Europe to Asia and North America. These genetic studies suggest interconnected, widespread populations with a level of genetic diversity that indicates substantial overall numbers. These combined lines of evidence, the extensive bone beds and the genetic data, paint a compelling picture of mammoth populations that were far larger and more widespread than earlier estimates had indicated. This dramatic upward revision of mammoth population size has significant ripple effects on our understanding of the Pleistocene ecosystem, the world of the last ice age. If mammoths were this numerous, they would have been a dominant force shaping the environment. Their grazing would have had a profound impact on grasslands and forests, influencing plant life and, consequently, other animal species that shared their habitat. They weren't just another animal in the Ice Age landscape. They were ecosystem engineers on a grand scale. Furthermore, this larger population context is crucial when considering their eventual extinction. While climate change and the shrinking of their habitat as the Ice Age ended played a major role, the question of human impact becomes more complex. If there were far more mammoths than previously thought, it implies that early human hunters would have had a more abundant food source, but it also perhaps lessens the likelihood that hunting alone was the sole or primary driver of their extinction across every region, especially in areas where human populations were sparse. A larger, more resilient population would presumably be harder to hunt into oblivion quickly. This revised understanding shifts the focus from a potentially fragile population to a robust one, requiring us to consider a more intricate interplay of factors, including environmental shifts, changes in vegetation, and human activity, to fully explain the disappearance of these magnificent creatures from the planet. For decades, the image of Neanderthals that dominated both scientific and popular thought was one of simple, brutish cavemen. They were often depicted as lumbering, unintelligent cousins to modern humans, lacking sophisticated thought, complex social structures, or any form of culture beyond basic survival instincts. This view was heavily influenced by early fossil discoveries, which sometimes presented Neanderthals with stooped postures and robust features, leading to interpretations of them as less evolved, perhaps even a dead end in the human family tree. Limited archaeological evidence available at the time seemed to support this, showing primarily stone tools that appeared rudimentary compared to those made by early Homo sapiens. This created a strong, long-standing bias that saw Neanderthals through a lens of perceived inferiority. But like so many historical narratives, this one has been dramatically rewritten by new evidence, particularly from the last couple of decades. Far from being simple brutes, recent archaeological finds reveal a much more complex and sophisticated picture of Neanderthal life and capabilities. We now have compelling evidence of Neanderthal art. Discoveries in caves in Spain, for example, show paintings that have been dated to be older than the earliest known art created by Homo sapiens in Europe. These weren't just random scribbles, they include geometric shapes, hand stencils, and symbols, indicating abstract thought and symbolic behavior, things previously considered unique to our own species. Their tool use was also far more advanced than initially believed. Beyond simple stone flakes, archaeologists have found evidence of Neanderthals creating complex multi-component tools, using adhesives and even modifying bone and ivory. They were skilled craftsmen, adapting their technology to their environment and needs, demonstrating ingenuity and forethought. Furthermore, there is growing evidence of intentional Neanderthal burial practices. Finding remains carefully placed, sometimes with grave goods like flowers or tools, suggests a capacity for symbolic behavior, ritual, and perhaps even a form of belief system or respect for their dead, a far cry from the image of unthinking creatures. Lingering questions about their ability to communicate complex ideas are also being addressed. Studies of their hyoid bone, crucial for speech, and analyses of their genetic makeup suggest they possessed the physical and potentially the cognitive capacity for language. These cumulative discoveries, from art to burials to tools, have revolutionized our understanding, shifting Neanderthals from being seen as dim-witted relatives to intelligent, culturally capable humans who shared the planet with our ancestors and engaged with the world in sophisticated ways. For years, the story of how dogs became our companions was thought to be a relatively recent chapter in human history. Many early theories placed the domestication of wolves, the ancestors of modern dogs, sometime within the last 10,000 years, perhaps linked to the development of settled agriculture and the rise of villages. The idea was that as humans became less nomadic and began farming, wolves might have been attracted to human settlements, scavenging for food scraps, and gradually, a relationship of mutual tolerance, then cooperation, and finally domestication developed. It seemed like a logical fit with the broader picture of human societal development during that time. Artifacts and artistic depictions that clearly showed dogs interacting with humans in ways we recognize as domestic seem to support this more recent timeline. However, the advent of genetic studies, combined with re-examination and new discoveries in archaeology, has completely revised this timeline, pushing the estimated date of dog domestication back significantly, potentially tens of thousands of years earlier than those initial theories suggested. Think about what genetic analysis can do. By studying the DNA of modern dogs, ancient dog remains, and wolves from different regions, scientists can trace evolutionary lineages and estimate when populations diverged. These studies have revealed genetic markers in dog DNA that indicate their split from wolf populations occurred much earlier than 10,000 years ago. Estimates now often fall somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, sometimes even earlier depending on the study and the methodology used. Furthermore, the genetic evidence points not to a single domestication event in one specific place, but potentially multiple domestication events occurring independently in different geographic locations across Eurasia, a much more complex and fascinating origin story. Complementing the genetic evidence are archaeological finds that support this earlier timeline. While clear skeletal remains of domesticated dogs are difficult to distinguish from wolves in the earliest stages, certain morphological changes, like changes in skull shape or tooth size, occur over time with domestication. The discovery of ancient canid remains showing these subtle signs of domestication, dated through methods like radiocarbon dating, align with the earlier dates suggested by genetic studies. Additionally, indirect evidence like canid footprints found alongside human footprints in ancient cave sites or remains found in contexts that suggest close association with early hunter-gatherer camps further supports the idea that humans and early dogs were interacting long before the agricultural revolution. These combined lines of evidence from genetics and archaeology paint a picture of a bond between humans and canids that stretches deep into the Paleolithic era, a partnership that was forged not in agricultural villages, but perhaps in the vast, open landscapes where early hunter-gatherers roamed, making the relationship between humans and dogs one of the oldest, if not the oldest, interspecies bond in history, a testament to a shared journey that began in a much more ancient time than previously imagined. Imagine finding an object that looks like nothing you've ever seen pulled from an ancient shipwreck. That's essentially what happened in 1900 when divers discovered the Antikythera mechanism off the coast of a Greek island. Covered in marine growth and corroded by salt water, the initial assessment of this strange bronze artifact was understandably cautious. It was often described as some kind of astrolabe, perhaps a simple device used by ancient mariners for navigation or basic astronomical observation. Astrolabes existed in the ancient world, and this seemed like a plausible if intriguing find. The complexity wasn't immediately apparent due to its heavily damaged state, leading to this initial, relatively humble interpretation of its purpose. But as time and technology advanced, so did our ability to peer inside this ancient enigma. Using sophisticated imaging techniques, particularly X-rays and later, micro-focus X-ray tomography, essentially creating three-dimensional scans of the corroded fragments, researchers could finally see beneath the surface and decipher the intricate inner workings. What they found was astonishing, completely shattering the idea of a simple astrolabe. The Antikythera mechanism was revealed to be an incredibly complex, geared astronomical calculator, a marvel of ancient Greek engineering that predated anything comparable by over 1,000 years. The scans unveiled a complex system of at least 30 finely crafted bronze gears, wheels within wheels, each designed to move at precise rates. This wasn't a simple device, it was a sophisticated machine capable of performing a wide range of astronomical calculations. It could predict the positions of the sun, moon, and likely several planets. More than that, it could predict eclipses, both solar and lunar, and even track the cycles of ancient Greek athletic events, including the Olympic Games. The device had multiple dials on its front and back, with pointers indicating various celestial phenomena and calendrical cycles. This meticulous analysis showed that the ancient Greeks possessed a level of mechanical and astronomical knowledge previously unimaginable, demonstrating their ability to translate complex mathematical theories into physical, functional models. Seeing the intricate precision of these ancient gears forced a complete re-evaluation of the technological capabilities of the Hellenistic world, proving they were capable of building machines of remarkable complexity and accuracy to understand and predict the movements of the cosmos. When we think about the late Bronze Age, roughly around 1200 BC, history often paints a picture of powerful, interconnected empires: the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, the kingdoms of Canaan, and others. Early historical accounts, drawing on written records from places like Egypt, tended to focus the story of the period's dramatic collapse on the eastern Mediterranean. These records described invasions by mysterious groups, often referred to as the Sea Peoples, and internal unrest, suggesting the troubles were primarily centered in this region, impacting civilizations like Egypt and the Hittite Empire. The assumption was that while there were disruptions, the collapse was somewhat localized, concentrated around the Aegean and the Near East, leaving other areas relatively untouched. However, as archaeological research has expanded across a much broader geographic area, the evidence tells a different story, one of a far more widespread, systemic collapse that simultaneously affected numerous interconnected civilizations across a vast swath of the ancient world. It wasn't just the big players in the eastern Mediterranean. Sites from Greece and Anatolia all the way through the Levant and into parts of Mesopotamia show signs of destruction, abandonment, and significant societal upheaval around this period. Cities were burnt, trade networks dissolved, and centralized political authority crumbled over a relatively short time frame. This simultaneous breakdown across multiple regions strongly suggests more than just isolated conflicts. Modern scholarship now views the Bronze Age collapse not as a single event, but as a cascading series of interconnected factors that created a perfect storm of instability. Climate change played a role. Evidence suggests a period of prolonged drought in key areas, stressing agricultural systems and potentially leading to famine and resource scarcity. This environmental stress likely fueled migrations, possibly including those of the Sea Peoples, as populations were pushed from their homelands in search of new resources or territory. These migrations, in turn, disrupted existing trade routes and settlements, further destabilizing the region. Add to this internal factors within civilization's social inequality, peasant revolts, and conflicts between ruling elites, and you have a complex tapestry of pressures. The interconnected nature of the Bronze Age world, with its long-distance trade routes and diplomatic ties, meant that the failure of one part of the system could easily spread and impact others, like dominoes falling one after another across a vast network. This broader archaeological perspective demonstrates that the late Bronze Age collapse was a global event for its time, a complex confluence of environmental, social, and political factors that reshaped the ancient world on a scale previously underestimated, revealing the fragility of even seemingly powerful civilizations when faced with multiple simultaneous crises. When we think about the great ages of ancient technology, the Bronze Age often stands out, right? And for a long time, the transition to the Iron Age was seen as a relatively distinct and later period, a significant leap occurring after centuries dominated by bronze. Historical timelines often place the widespread adoption and use of iron technology much later, perhaps around the end of the second millennium BC or even later in some regions after the decline of the great Bronze Age empires. The assumption was that iron smelting was a complex process that took a long time to develop and spread. But like so many boundaries in history, the line between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and the timeline for when iron technology really got going, has proven to be a lot blurrier and earlier than previously thought. Archaeological excavations in various parts of the ancient world have unearthed iron artifacts dating back much further than those traditional timelines suggested. We're talking about objects found in contexts firmly rooted in the Bronze Age, long before iron was supposed to have become commonplace. These early finds, though sometimes small or relatively rare compared to bronze items, provided tantalizing clues that metalworkers were experimenting with or even producing iron much earlier than the conventional narrative allowed. Understanding this shift requires a quick look at how iron is actually made, a process quite different from bronze. Bronze is an alloy, typically copper mixed with tin, both metals that can be melted at relatively low temperatures in ancient furnaces and then cast into shape. Iron, on the other hand, requires much higher temperatures to extract from its ore, and the process involves solid-state reduction in a furnace, producing a spongy mass of iron and slag called a bloom, which then needs to be repeatedly heated and hammered to remove impurities and consolidate the metal. This high-temperature process was indeed more challenging to perfect with ancient technology. However, it appears that early metalworkers in different regions were figuring out how to do this, or at least produce usable iron in limited quantities earlier than previously thought. Evidence of early iron smelting sites, identified by things like slag heaps containing residues from iron production, have been found in areas like Anatolia, modern Turkey, and the Levant, dating back to the late 2nd millennium BC and even earlier. The earlier adoption of iron had profound impacts on ancient societies even before it became widespread. Initially, iron might have been rarer and perhaps even more prized than bronze, used for special objects or tools. But as the technology of smelting and working iron improved and spread, unlocking its potential, it became more accessible than bronze, whose key component, tin, was often sourced from distant and limited locations along complex trade routes. Iron ore, in contrast, was more widely available in many regions. This shift meant that tools and weapons could eventually be produced more cheaply and in larger quantities, potentially leading to changes in agriculture, warfare, and daily life. The realization that iron was being worked and used significantly earlier than the formal Iron Age designation pushes back the timeline for these societal transformations and shows that the development of this crucial metal wasn't a sudden leap, but a more gradual process with deeper roots in the Bronze Age itself. He's often called the father of history, Herodotus, a Greek writer living in the 5th century BC, whose monumental work, The Histories, attempted to explain the causes and events of the Greco-Persian Wars by delving into the backgrounds and customs of the peoples involved. For centuries, while his work was a critical primary source, certain parts of it were taken with a grain of salt, or perhaps even a whole shaker. His accounts of distant lands, strange customs, and seemingly fantastical creatures were often viewed as highly embellished, incorporating mythology and travelers' tales that weren't strictly factual observations. Academics long debated which parts of Herodotus were reliable historical reporting and which were closer to entertaining fiction. It was easy to cherry-pick the seemingly rational parts about battles and politics and dismiss the more colorful descriptions of places like Egypt or the lands beyond the Persian Empire as pure fantasy. Take, for instance, his descriptions of the gold-digging ants of India. Herodotus wrote of creatures larger than foxes but smaller than dogs that would excavate gold dust while burrowing. The local people, he claimed, would then cleverly steal this gold from the ants' mounds. For a long time, this sounded like something straight out of a fable, a wild tale from a distant, poorly understood land meant to marvel or perhaps mislead. Another example was his account of the Egyptian practice of mummification, describing a detailed, step-by-step process involving the removal of organs and the use of natron to preserve the body. While mummification was known, the specifics he provided were so precise that some questioned if he truly had such intimate knowledge or was simply recounting exaggerated reports. Yet, surprisingly, modern research and archaeology have provided stunning vindication for some of Herodotus's most doubted claims. Regarding the gold-digging ants, scholars now believe Herodotus was likely describing marmots, common in certain parts of the Himalayas and known for their burrowing habits, which do unearth sediment containing gold flakes during excavation. The seemingly fantastical ants were likely a misinterpretation or a colorful description passed through multiple languages and cultures before reaching Herodotus. As for mummification, later archaeological discoveries and scientific analyses of mummified remains have corroborated many of the intricate details Herodotus provided about the embalming process, showing his account was remarkably accurate and based on real procedures. These examples, among others, illustrate a crucial point. Even within a historical work that clearly incorporates elements of myth, legend, and hearsay, there can be a significant core of factual information waiting to be confirmed by future discoveries. It teaches us the value of not dismissing ancient sources entirely, but approaching them with critical analysis and an openness to the possibility that seemingly improbable details might contain traces of historical truth. Step back into the ancient world for a moment. What kind of picture comes to mind? For many, it's a world dominated by male rulers, male warriors, male philosophers shaping the course of events. Traditional historical narratives, often written by men focusing on battles, politics, and public life, frequently presented women as largely confined to the home, their roles limited to domestic tasks like weaving and child-rearing. They were often portrayed as minor figures in the grand sweep of history, their voices unheard, their contributions overlooked. This was the standard view for a very long time, a seemingly settled understanding based on the limited perspectives available in certain historical sources. Yet, as historical research has become more inclusive and rigorous, drawing on a wider range of evidence, a far more complex and dynamic image of women in ancient societies has emerged, one that powerfully challenges that earlier, limited view. Think about the silent stories contained within archaeological finds. Graves, for instance, yielding not just the remains of individuals, but also the objects buried with them: tools, jewelry, personal items, offering glimpses into their roles and status beyond the purely domestic. Discoveries of workshops or marketplaces reveal evidence of women's participation in various crafts and economic activities, demonstrating they weren't solely reliant on male relatives for subsistence. Beyond the material culture, epigraphic evidence, inscriptions found on stone, pottery, or metal has been crucial. These can be anything from dedications on temple walls to names listed on business records, showing women involved in trade, owning property, making religious offerings, and holding positions within religious cults. These inscriptions, though sometimes brief, provide direct evidence of their presence and activities in the public sphere, chipping away at the idea of total confinement to the home. Furthermore, the reinterpretation of existing texts, looking at them through a lens that seeks to understand women's experiences and agency, has unearthed hidden narratives. Even in texts seemingly focused on men, careful reading can reveal information about women's legal rights, their involvement in family businesses, their influence behind the scenes in politics, and their vital roles in religious rituals that were central to community life. These diverse sources paint a picture of women not as passive figures, but as active participants in the economic life of their communities, influential within religious structures, and sometimes even wielding political power, whether directly or through family connections. It forces us to acknowledge the diverse realities of women's lives across different ancient cultures and time periods, revealing a history that was far more balanced and complex than previously understood, with women playing significant and varied roles often overlooked by earlier generations of historians. Consider the classic image of a medieval knight, a heavily armored warrior mounted on a powerful horse charging into battle with sword or lance. This picture is central to our understanding of medieval warfare and the chivalric ideal. For a long time, the prevailing view of medieval armies emphasized the dominance of heavy cavalry, the mounted knights, as the decisive force on the battlefield. The belief was that their shock power, their ability to smash into enemy lines, was the primary factor determining the outcome of battles. Infantry, the foot soldiers, were often seen as less important, primarily there to support the knights or to hold ground, lacking the prestige and impact of the mounted warrior. This perspective, influenced by romanticized accounts of chivalry and battles like Agincourt, where English archers played a key role, but the ideal was still the knight, led to an underappreciation of the role of non-mounted troops. However, a closer look at historical sources, including chronicles that detailed troop compositions and battle tactics, along with archaeological evidence from battlefields, reveals a much more nuanced reality. While heavy cavalry was undoubtedly important and could be devastatingly effective, especially in the right circumstances, they were far from the only or always the decisive force. Infantry played absolutely crucial roles, often bearing the brunt of the fighting and providing the stability needed for armies to function. Think of the Swiss pikemen, highly disciplined infantry formations that could effectively counter cavalry charges, or the English longbowmen, whose devastating volleys of arrows could break up enemy formations before they ever reached the main lines, significantly diminishing the impact of cavalry. Medieval armies were, in fact, often much more balanced forces than the popular image of knightly dominance suggests. They included a mix of heavy and light infantry, archers, crossbowmen, and various types of mounted troops. The effectiveness of an army often depended on the skilled coordination of these different elements, with infantry providing a solid base, archers and crossbowmen providing ranged fire, and cavalry used for charges, flanking maneuvers, or pursuing a broken enemy. Furthermore, factors like terrain, weather, and tactical planning were often just as important as the presence of knights. Battles fought in broken terrain, for example, could negate the advantage of cavalry, giving the upper hand to well-trained infantry. This revised understanding highlights the complexity of medieval warfare, moving beyond the romanticized focus on the knight to appreciate the vital contributions of all soldiers who fought on foot, demonstrating that victory often relied on the effective combination and strategic deployment of diverse troop types. Most people, when they think of ancient Roman cities, picture vast, bustling metropolises connected by those famous straight, well-built roads and plumbing. Yes, we know the Romans had impressive aqueducts and some public baths with running water. The initial understanding of Roman urban life and infrastructure often focused on these large-scale, monumental achievements, the public works that are most visible in the archaeological record. The widespread availability and everyday use of running water and sanitation within individual homes or even throughout the bulk of residential areas was frequently underestimated or considered a luxury limited to the wealthy elite. The assumption was that most ordinary Romans relied on public fountains and basic sanitation methods, with advanced plumbing being an exception rather than a widespread feature. However, extensive archaeological excavations and detailed studies of residential areas in Roman cities, not just the grand public buildings, have painted a different picture, revealing a surprisingly complex and extensive network of water supply and drainage that reached far more ordinary homes than previously thought. In cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by volcanic ash, we see clear evidence of lead pipes running through streets and into individual houses, supplying running water to kitchens and even private baths or latrines. While not every single dwelling had running water, it was far more common in residential districts than earlier general assumptions allowed for. The Romans developed sophisticated systems for distributing water from their aqueducts through lead pipes and bronze fittings, controlling pressure and flow with valves and stopcocks. Equally important, though often less visible today, were their drainage and sewage systems. Underneath the streets of many Roman cities lay extensive networks of sewers designed to carry away wastewater and rainwater. These weren't just basic ditches, they were often vaulted channels, some large enough to walk through, demonstrating a significant investment in public health infrastructure. While not as elaborate as modern systems, they played a crucial role in managing waste and preventing disease in densely populated urban environments. The presence of latrines, both public and private, connected to these drainage systems further underscores the Romans' understanding of sanitation. This detailed archaeological evidence forces us to revise our image of daily life in Roman cities. It shows that access to running water and basic sanitation was not solely a privilege of the elite, but was available to a broader segment of the urban population, indicating a level of public health awareness and engineering capability that had been previously underestimated. It highlights that Roman ingenuity extended well beyond monumental structures to the more mundane yet vital aspects of urban living. Gazing out across the windswept landscape of Rapa Nui or Easter Island, you can't help but be struck by the hundreds of massive stone statues, the moai, standing silently on their platforms or ahu. For a long time, the most common explanation for these incredible feats of ancient engineering was that they were primarily religious idols, representations of deities or spirits meant for worship. Early travelers and researchers, seeing their monumental size and placement at ceremonial sites, naturally gravitated towards this interpretation, viewing them primarily through the lens of religious iconography. This seemed like the most fitting function for such impressive, labor-intensive creations in a seemingly isolated culture. Yet, like so many historical mysteries, the purpose of the moai appears to be far more multifaceted than that singular religious explanation allowed. Recent research drawing on archaeology, anthropology, and even environmental science suggests the moai served a more complex set of roles within the Rapa Nui society. One compelling theory emphasizes ancestor reverence. The statues are thought to represent important ancestors of the island's different clans, serving as a way to connect the living with the deceased and perhaps to harness their spiritual power mana for the benefit of the community. Their placement facing inland towards the villages rather than out to sea supports this idea they were watching over and protecting their descendants. Beyond ancestor worship, some scholars propose the moai also functioned as territorial markers. With limited resources on the island and different clans vying for control of productive land, particularly areas with access to fresh water, these monumental statues might have served as highly visible symbols of a clan's presence and authority over specific areas. The sheer effort required to carve, transport, and erect them would have been a powerful demonstration of a clan's strength, organization, and ability to mobilize labor, reinforcing social hierarchies and territorial claims. Even more intriguingly, some research suggests a link between moai placement and agricultural practices or water sources. analyzing the location of Ahu and Moe in relation to soil fertility, rainfall patterns, and natural springs indicates that many were strategically positioned in areas vital for sustenance. While not directly used in farming, their presence might have been tied to rituals or beliefs intended to ensure the fertility of the land or the availability of precious fresh water. The debate among researchers continues, but the consensus is clear. The Moai were not just simple idols, they were complex cultural artifacts interwoven with ancestor veneration, social structure, territoriality, and perhaps even the practical concerns of survival on a remote island, revealing a level of sophistication in Rapa Nui society that moves far beyond a simplistic religious explanation. Think about the maps we use today, their attempts, however imperfect, to represent a round planet on a flat surface. When we think of globes, those miniature models of Earth, they often seem like products of the age of exploration, the Renaissance, a time when ships were sailing across oceans and mapping the world. It's easy to assume that before this era, the concept of a spherical Earth and ways to represent it geographically on something like a globe were either unknown or extremely limited. The common belief places the widespread understanding of a round Earth and attempts to map it as a relatively late development in human history. Yet, the idea of a spherical Earth isn't nearly as modern as many assume. Long before the great voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries, scholars in ancient Greece had not only figured out that the Earth was a sphere, but had even made remarkably accurate calculations about its size. Figures like Pythagoras, as early as the 6th century BC, are credited with suggesting a spherical Earth based on philosophical arguments. Later, Aristotle, observing the curved shadow the Earth cast on the Moon during a lunar eclipse and noting how different stars were visible from different latitudes, provided compelling empirical evidence for a round planet. This wasn't just speculation, it was based on careful observation of the natural world. Perhaps the most stunning example of this early knowledge comes from Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a Greek scholar living in the 3rd century BC. Head of the library at Alexandria, Eratosthenes devised an ingenious method to calculate the circumference of the Earth. He noted that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a well in Syene modern Aswan, Egypt, casting no shadow, meaning it was directly overhead. At the same time in Alexandria, located roughly due north, he measured the angle of a shadow cast by a stick. Knowing the distance between Syene and Alexandria, and using basic geometry, he was able to calculate the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. His estimate was within a few percentage points of modern measurements. This feat demonstrates not only a clear understanding of a spherical Earth, but also sophisticated mathematical and astronomical skills applied to geodesy. While they may not have created portable globes as we know them from the Renaissance, these ancient Greek thinkers clearly grasped the fundamental shape of our planet and even attempted to quantify it, pushing back the timeline for this significant geographical understanding by well over 1,000 years. Did ancient people just eat whatever was available, a simple, monotonous diet dictated by their immediate surroundings? For a long time, historical thought often leaned towards this idea, picturing early humans and even later ancient civilizations subsisting on a fairly limited range of foods, maybe some basic grains, a few types of meat if they could hunt it, and whatever wild plants were easily gathered. The assumption was that without modern agricultural diversity and global trade, their meals would be repetitive and lacking in nutritional complexity. This view saw ancient societies as constrained by their environment, their plates reflecting a narrow selection of locally sourced staples, perhaps supplemented with occasional treats. However, the soil beneath our feet holds secrets that reveal a much more vibrant and varied culinary past. Archaeological science, through meticulous analysis of ancient human remains and discarded food refuse, has painted a completely different picture. Think about analyzing tooth enamel or bone collagen. These tissues absorb chemical signatures from the food and water we consume throughout life. Isotopes of carbon and nitrogen found in human bones can reveal the balance of plant and animal protein in a person's diet, indicating whether they relied more heavily on meat, fish, or cultivated crops. Looking at things like strontium isotopes can even give clues about geographical movement and where a person sourced their food during different stages of their life. Meanwhile, sifting through the remains of ancient meals like charred seeds, fragments of pottery with residue, and carefully identified animal bones from archaeological layers tells us directly what people were cooking and eating. These finds confirm a far wider range of consumed plants and animals than previously imagined. What these studies consistently show is surprising dietary diversity and complexity, varying significantly not just between major civilizations but also within different regions and time periods. Ancient Egyptians, while relying heavily on bread and beer made from cereals like emmer wheat and barley, also consumed a variety of fruits, vegetables, fish from the Nile, and domesticated animals. In prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies, genetic and archaeological evidence points to diets rich in diverse wild plants, game, and fish, adapted to specific local environments. Even in early farming communities, while cereals were central, they were often supplemented with pulses, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and domesticated animals. Residue analysis on ancient pottery has revealed the presence of things like dairy products, oils, and even fermented beverages other than beer. This research doesn't just list ingredients, it provides insights into how ancient people adapted to their environments, utilized available resources, and developed sophisticated methods of food acquisition, preparation, and preservation. It shows that their health and nutritional status were directly tied to the variety and balance of their diets, revealing that ancient sustenance was far from simple or monolithic, but a reflection of ingenuity and diverse interaction with the natural world. Picture early humans roaming the landscape, perhaps in small family units, barely interacting with anyone outside their immediate kin. That solitary image, or at best one of very small, simple bands, was a prevailing notion for quite some time. It fit a narrative of humans just scratching out a living, focused solely on individual or immediate family survival in a harsh, unforgiving world. Complex social structures, intricate cooperation beyond the most basic level, and larger community living seemed like developments that came much later in human history after agriculture and settled life. This view often saw early human groups as transient and loosely connected, lacking the organization for anything truly large-scale. What the shovel and the microscope have revealed tells a fundamentally different story, showcasing a much richer tapestry of social life among our ancient ancestors. Archaeological sites dating back hundreds of thousands of years provide compelling insights into early human behavior that point strongly towards cooperation on a scale previously underestimated. Consider the evidence found at ancient hunting sites. We're not just talking about finding a few scattered animal bones here and there. Excavations have uncovered enormous accumulations of bones from large game animals, often concentrated in locations strategically chosen to trap or drive herds like cliff faces or natural bottlenecks. Moreover, analysis of the butchery marks on these bones suggests coordinated efforts, indicating that groups of hunters worked together to bring down and process these massive animals. This level of coordination and sharing of resources speaks volumes about the need for larger group sizes and a degree of social organization capable of planning and executing complex hunts. Beyond hunting, evidence of early shelter construction further complicates the idea of solitary living. Sites dating back hundreds of thousands of years have revealed the remains of surprisingly sophisticated structures, not just simple windbreaks, but deliberate constructions using wood, bone, and perhaps hides, often with hearths indicating prolonged occupation. Some of these structures are large enough that they would have housed multiple individuals or even extended families comfortably. Think about the planning and cooperation required to gather the materials, transport them, and then construct a durable shelter capable of withstanding the elements. This wasn't a one-person job. It required coordination, shared knowledge, and a division of labor within a group. The sheer presence of these larger, more complex shelters suggests that early humans were living in more stable, larger social units than the image of isolated individuals or tiny families allowed for. This cumulative archaeological evidence pushes back the timeline for the development of complex social structures, revealing that cooperation, community, and perhaps even things akin to what we might call culture were deeply ingrained aspects of the human experience far earlier than traditional narratives suggested. For the longest time, if you were to pinpoint the birth of writing, the finger typically pointed to ancient Sumeria in Mesopotamia around the late 4th millennium BC. The sophisticated cuneiform script developed there, pressed into clay tablets, was widely regarded as the world's very first form of writing, a system capable of recording complex transactions, laws, and literature. This narrative of a single origin point in Sumeria was the standard historical view, making Mesopotamia the cradle of literacy and bureaucratic record-keeping, a monumental invention that then, presumably, influenced other cultures. But the story of writing's origin seems to be far more complex and potentially much older and more geographically diverse than that singular focus allowed. Archaeological discoveries in other regions have unearthed intriguing evidence of symbolic systems and what some scholars argue are early forms of writing or proto-writing that predate or developed independently of Sumerian cuneiform. Consider, for example, the signs found on artifacts from the Indus Valley civilization, flourishing in what is now Pakistan and northwest India during the 3rd millennium BC. While this script remains largely undeciphered, the sheer number of symbols, their recurring patterns, and their context on seals and other objects suggest a system used for communication or record-keeping, hinting at a level of complexity that points towards a potential writing system. Whether it's a fully functional script or something just short of it is still debated, but its presence challenges the idea that writing emerged only in Mesopotamia at that time. Look also to ancient Egypt. While hieroglyphics are well known, discoveries at sites like Abydos have revealed Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions dating back to roughly the same period as early Sumerian cuneiform, potentially even slightly earlier. These early Egyptian symbols appear on tags and labels associated with grave goods, suggesting they were used for administrative or commemorative purposes. The complexity and context of these symbols have led many to argue that writing in Egypt developed independently and perhaps concurrently with, if not slightly before, Sumerian writing. Furthermore, even earlier discoveries, like symbols found on Vinca culture artifacts in southeastern Europe, dating back to the 6th or 5th millennium BC, while not generally accepted as a full writing system, represent complex symbolic communication from a remarkably early period. These findings collectively suggest that writing wasn't necessarily a single invention that spread forth like a wave from one origin point. Instead, the development of complex symbolic systems, driven by various societal needs like administration, religious practices, or trade, may have occurred independently in multiple locations across the ancient world at different times, revealing a more intricate and potentially multi-origin development of one of humanity's most transformative inventions. It's easy to think of ancient civilizations as being primarily shaped by human actions, battles won and lost, political decisions, trade routes. For a long time, the profound influence of the natural world, particularly changes in climate, was often seen as a minor factor, a backdrop to the main drama of human history. Environmental shifts, droughts, or periods of cooling or warming were acknowledged, certainly, but their connection to the major turning points in civilizations, their growth, their prosperity, and even their collapse wasn't fully appreciated or deeply investigated. The human element seemed more central to the story than long-term environmental processes, unlocking the secrets held within ice cores, tree rings, and layers of sediment from lakes and oceans has dramatically changed this perspective. These sources provide what's known as paleoclimate data, offering incredibly detailed records of past temperatures, precipitation patterns, and even atmospheric composition, stretching back thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. When this detailed climate data is combined with meticulous archaeological evidence from ancient sites looking at things like agricultural practices, settlement patterns, shifts in diet, and the presence of fortifications or evidence of conflict, a powerful picture emerges of ancient societies deeply intertwined with and highly vulnerable to environmental change. Consider the collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia around 2200 BC. This was one of the earliest large-scale empires, remarkably sophisticated for its time. While historical texts are sparse, paleoclimate data reveals a severe, centuries-long drought struck the region during the period of its decline. Archaeological evidence from sites that were once part of the empire shows signs of widespread abandonment, particularly in the rain-fed agricultural areas of the north, and a massive influx of people towards the southern cities, likely straining resources. This isn't to say the drought was the only cause. Internal social tensions and external pressures also played a role. But the overwhelming environmental stress, likely leading to crop failures and famine, appears to have been a critical, perhaps even the primary, catalyst for the Akkadian state's disintegration, a factor largely underappreciated until climate data provided the crucial context. Jump forward in time and across the globe to the classic Maya civilization, which flourished in Mesoamerica. For centuries, they built magnificent cities, developed a complex writing system, and achieved sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Yet, between the 8th and 10th centuries AD, many of the major Maya centers in the southern lowlands went into a steep decline, with populations dwindling and cities eventually abandoned. Early theories focused on internal warfare, peasant revolts, or disease. While these may have been contributing factors, paleoclimate records from the region, obtained from lake cores, now provide compelling evidence of a series of intense, prolonged droughts during this very period of collapse. These droughts would have severely impacted the Maya's rain-dependent agriculture, their complex water management systems like reservoirs, and their ability to sustain large urban populations. The stress on their environment, amplified by centuries of intensive agriculture, seems to have pushed communities past a tipping point, revealing how even seemingly robust and advanced societies could be profoundly vulnerable to long-term climate shifts. These examples, and many others from different periods and places, demonstrate that climate change was not a minor historical footnote but a powerful, sometimes devastating, force that significantly shaped the trajectory of ancient civilizations, influencing everything from migration and resource conflict to the very survival of complex societies. When we think about ancient mariners setting sail into vast, open waters, it's easy to imagine them nervously hugging the coastline, afraid to venture too far from sight of land. For a long time, the prevailing view was that early navigation was relatively basic, relying primarily on staying within sight of shore or using simple observations of familiar stars near the horizon at night. Deep-sea voyages traversing thousands of miles across the open ocean were often considered beyond the capabilities of ancient sailors, seen as feats only achieved much later in history. This assumption limited our understanding of ancient exploration and trade, picturing it as a more constrained, regional affair rather than a truly global enterprise. But peer closer at the evidence, both archaeological and through the lens of cultural history, and a much more sophisticated picture of ancient seafaring emerges. New research and the reinterpretation of existing artifacts and accounts tell a compelling story of mariners who possessed skills and knowledge allowing them to navigate far from the safety of shore. It appears they weren't just simple coastal hopscotchers. They were capable of complex celestial navigation, understanding of ocean currents, and utilizing techniques that resemble what we might call dead reckoning, calculating their position based on direction, speed, and elapsed time. Consider cultures like the ancient Polynesians, whose incredible voyages across vast stretches of the Pacific are legendary. Their navigational methods, passed down through generations, involved intricate knowledge of swell patterns, the flight paths of birds, the color of the sea reflecting lagoons invisible below the horizon, and crucially, a deep understanding of the night sky. They essentially carried mental star charts with them, knowing which stars rose and set at specific points on the horizon and how these changed as they moved across different latitudes. This wasn't simple stargazing. It was a complex system of tracking celestial movements to determine direction and latitude, allowing them to pinpoint tiny islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. Looking closer at the Mediterranean, while coastal trade was vital, evidence also points to more ambitious voyages. Ancient texts like those describing journeys across the open Mediterranean or into the Atlantic suggest a reliance on detailed sailing directions, knowledge of prevailing winds and currents, and certainly celestial observation when land was out of sight. Archaeological finds, though rare, of navigational tools and astronomical devices from ancient shipwrecks offer tantalizing clues about the instruments they might have used. While perhaps not compasses or sextants as we know them, they show an interest in quantifying and tracking position. Furthermore, the very presence of ancient trade goods found far from their origin points like Roman artifacts in India or Indian spices in the Mediterranean points towards established, reliable sea routes that would have required more than just luck and good weather. They would have demanded capable navigation across open water, revealing a level of maritime skill that was far more advanced than previously credited. When did humans stop being purely hunter-gatherers and start planting seeds, cultivating fields, and domesticating animals? For a long time, the accepted wisdom placed the origin of agriculture relatively late in human history, perhaps around 10,000 years ago, and pointed to a single, specific region as the birthplace of farming, the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. This area, encompassing parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, had ideal conditions for growing early crops like wheat and barley and domesticating animals like sheep and goats. The idea was that this revolutionary development happened in one hotspot and then slowly spread to other parts of the world through migration and cultural exchange. It was a neat, understandable narrative agriculture as a single invention originating in one place. However, the spade and the scientific lab have unearthed evidence showing this story was far too simplistic and quite a bit off the mark. Archaeological discoveries made over the past few decades in disparate corners of the globe have pushed back the timeline for the earliest evidence of plant cultivation and animal domestication significantly. More importantly, these finds strongly suggest that agriculture didn't just pop up in one Golden Age region and radiate outwards. Instead, it appears to have been developed independently in multiple different parts of the world, at roughly similar times or even earlier than initially thought in some cases, driven by local environments and the ingenuity of diverse human populations. Think about rice cultivation in East Asia. Archaeological evidence from China points to rice farming occurring as early as 10,000, potentially even 12,000 years ago, completely independent of the developments in the Fertile Crescent. The grains being cultivated, the methods used, and the animals domesticated were entirely different, demonstrating a separate trajectory of agricultural invention. Consider also the Americas. Maize or corn, squash, and beans formed the basis of agriculture in Mesoamerica. Evidence from sites in what is now Mexico shows the domestication of maize taking place over a long period starting perhaps 9,000 years ago, developing from wild grasses into the staple crop that would support civilizations like the Maya and Aztecs. Again, this was a completely independent development, involving different plants and animals than those found in the Middle East or East Asia. In the Andes region of South America, the domestication of potatoes and llamas occurred independently around the same time frame. Even in places like New Guinea, archaeological work has revealed evidence of the independent domestication of taro and yams thousands of years ago. These diverse examples, spread across continents and involving completely different sets of plants and animals, undeniably demonstrate that agriculture was not a singular invention. It was a fundamental shift in human subsistence strategies that arose independently in multiple places, a testament to the adaptability and innovative capacity of human societies across the globe, revealing a much richer and more complex origin story for farming than was ever imagined just a few decades ago. For decades, the popular image of dinosaurs was one of clumsy, slow-moving giants with tiny brains, often dismissed as inherently unintelligent, little more than overgrown lizards driven by simple instinct. Early paleontologists examining the relatively small brain cavities of some of the largest dinosaurs compared to their massive body size concluded they must have been dim-witted creatures, simply lumbering through their existence until extinction. Books and documentaries often reinforce this notion of dumb dinosaurs, emphasizing bulk and brute force over any capacity for complex thought or behavior. It was an easily digestible narrative, fitting neatly into an idea of evolution steadily progressing towards greater intelligence, with dinosaurs representing an earlier, less sophisticated stage. However, the fossil record, combined with modern neurological studies and behavioral analysis, has painted a dramatically different and far more fascinating picture of dinosaur intelligence and behavior. It's become clear that generalizing intelligence across all dinosaurs, which spanned over 160 million years and included thousands of different species, is like trying to lump together all mammals from mice to whales. New fossil discoveries, particularly those preserving skulls with more detail about brain size and structure, and even rare finds of fossilized brain tissue, have revealed a much wider range of brain-to-body ratios and neuroanatomy among dinosaurs. Some smaller theropods, the group that includes birds, possessed surprisingly large brains relative to their size, suggesting higher cognitive abilities than their colossal cousins. Beyond just brain size, the evidence for more complex dinosaur behavior comes from a variety of sources. Fossil trackways, for instance, provide stunning evidence of social behavior. Finding multiple dinosaur footprints of the same species moving in parallel, sometimes over long distances, strongly suggests herding or group movements, a level of social organization requiring communication and coordination. Discoveries of bone beds containing large numbers of individuals of the same species further support the idea of gregarious behavior. Analyzing nesting sites, particularly those with multiple nests close together containing fossilized eggs and even juvenile remains, indicate some dinosaurs engaged in colonial nesting, perhaps offering communal protection to their young. Furthermore, examinations of the teeth, jaws, and stomach contents of predatory dinosaurs reveal sophisticated hunting strategies, sometimes involving multiple individuals. Evidence of healed injuries on prey animals that suggest they survived initial attacks points to persistent pursuit and perhaps even pack hunting tactics. These combined lines of evidence, moving beyond just skeletal structure to interpret behavior and capabilities, have fundamentally shifted our view, transforming dinosaurs from mere dumb lizards into a diverse group of animals, some of whom exhibited surprisingly advanced behaviors, complex social structures, and a level of problem-solving that challenges our long-held assumptions about intelligence. Imagine a tiny, fragile strand broken into countless pieces, buried for thousands of years. For a long time, scientists believed that ancient DNA, locked away in bones and teeth from long-dead organisms, would be exactly that: too fragmented, too degraded by time, and the elements to yield any meaningful genetic information. The harsh reality of decomposition seemed to make extracting usable DNA from truly ancient specimens a near impossibility. While tantalizing, the idea of reading the genetic code of our distant ancestors or the creatures they lived alongside felt like science fiction, beyond the reach of practical historical or biological research. Our understanding of deep history was limited to what archaeology could tell us about their tools and settlements, and what linguistics could suggest about the movement of languages. Then came a revolution in genetic technology, a breakthrough that allowed researchers to recover and analyze those seemingly broken strands of ancient DNA. Advancements in sequencing techniques, which can now read even highly fragmented pieces of genetic material and piece them back together like a microscopic puzzle, completely overturned that long-held assumption of impossibility. Suddenly, the genetic code of individuals who lived tens of thousands of years ago, even hundreds of thousands of years ago, became accessible. This wasn't just a modest improvement, it was a paradigm shift, opening up an entirely new window into the past, allowing us to ask questions about human history that we couldn't have even formulated before. The insights gained from this ancient DNA analysis are nothing short of transformative. It's allowed us to trace the paths of human migration with unprecedented detail, confirming or revising previous theories based on archaeological finds. We can now see, for example, the complex movements of early Homo sapiens out of Africa and their interactions with groups like Neanderthals and Denisovans, even discovering evidence of interbreeding by finding traces of their DNA in modern human populations. Beyond broad movements, ancient DNA can reveal the structure of ancient populations, showing us who was living where, how connected different groups were, and even providing clues about social organization and kinship. Furthermore, this technology is shedding light on the history of ancient diseases. By analyzing pathogens preserved in ancient remains, researchers are gaining new understanding of the evolution and spread of devastating illnesses, offering insights into past epidemics and potentially even informing strategies for dealing with diseases today. This genetic revolution has moved history from simply studying what people left behind to understanding who they biologically were, fundamentally reshaping countless narratives about our collective past. So, we've journeyed through 30 incredible instances from the debunked Piltdown Man to the vibrantly painted statues of antiquity, from Viking landings in North America centuries before Columbus to the surprising complexity of ancient engineering and the deep history revealed by ancient DNA. Each one of these examples shows us something truly fundamental about history. It's not a fixed story written in stone and unchanging. Instead, it's a dynamic, ever-evolving field, constantly being reshaped by new discoveries, fresh perspectives, and the relentless work of researchers challenging established ideas. What we think we know today is simply the best understanding we have right now, based on the evidence currently available. Think of it this way: every archaeological dig, every newly translated text, every scientific analysis of an ancient artifact or organism is like adding a new puzzle piece to an enormous, complex picture of the past. Sometimes those new pieces simply fill in gaps, adding detail to an existing image, but other times they force us to completely rearrange the pieces we thought were already in place, revealing connections we never saw or showing us that the picture itself is entirely different from what we initially imagined. This constant process of discovery and revision isn't a flaw in history. It's its greatest strength, a testament to the ongoing human quest to understand where we came from and how we got here. These stories should encourage us all to approach historical narratives with a healthy dose of curiosity and, yes, even skepticism. When you read a historical account or watch a documentary, ask yourself, what is this based on? What evidence is being presented? Are there other interpretations? The most exciting thing about history is knowing that the next big revelation, the next piece of evidence that rewrites our understanding, could be just around the corner. Future generations, armed with technologies and insights we can only dream of, will undoubtedly continue to challenge and revise what we accept as historical fact today. Which of these 30 historical shifts did you find the most surprising? Was it the early date of agriculture, the navigational skills of ancient mariners, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're as fascinated by the ever-unfolding mysteries of the past as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into the incredible complexities of history.